Okay, I think we'll get started and more people might trickle in. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's event, The Spectacular Generic Pharmaceuticals and the Semi-Political in Mexico. We have a conversation with Professors Corey Hayden and Mara Loveman. I'm Julia Bird, the Vice Chair at the UC Berkeley Center for Latin American Studies. I'm so happy to welcome you all here. This event is the latest installment in our Novedades Lanzamientos series. The series highlights new work from UC Berkeley scholars on Latin America and the Caribbean. And with every great event, this one has a multitude of people who have worked to make it come to life. I want to thank Janet Wagaman, Gregory Loudon, and Natalia Brizuela of the Center for Latin American Studies for your tireless work behind the scenes. In a minute, I'll hand you over to our presenters, to our speakers for today's event. But first, let me provide two brief introductions. Corey Hayden is a professor of anthropology at UC Berkeley. Her research focuses on the anthropology of the biochemical sciences, global pharmaceutical politics, and post-colonial engagements with intellectual property, copying, and the politics of innovation and appropriation. Professor Hayden's latest book, you may recognize the title, The Spectacular Generic Pharmaceuticals and the Semi-Political in Mexico, was released by Duke this year. Congratulations. In this book, Professor Hayden examines how generic drugs have transformed public health politics and everyday experiences of pharmaceutical consumption in Latin America. Focusing on Mexican pharmacy chain Farmacias Similares, Hayden shows how generics have become potent commodities in a post-patent world. Professor Hayden will discuss her book in conversation with Mara Loveman, professor of sociology at UC Berkeley. Professor Loveman is a political and historical sociologist with broad interests in ethno-racial politics, nationalism, and the state. Her research interests also include the sociology of development, biopolitics, necropolitics, and the demography of ethno-racial difference and inequality, and social theory, with a regional focus on Latin America. During the event, we welcome questions from the audience, and we've enabled the Q&A feature on Zoom. You can find the Q&A button down below. The little button, type your question in, and we'll record it and hopefully get to it at the end of the event. I'm going to hand it over to Professor Hayden. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I'm going to just get my own slides geared up here, and I think Janet is going to share my slides for you all. So first of all, huge thanks to Natalia Brizuela for the invitation to do this talk with you all, to Julia Bird and Janet Wagaman for their enormous help, to Greg, and most of all to Mara Loveman, who is not only a brilliant scholar of race and nationalism classification in Latin America, but an incredibly sharp and astute reader and interlocutor. And I'm so honored, Mara, that you agreed to participate in this conversation with me. So thank you for that. I'm going to spend about 12-15 minutes right now just introducing you, audience, to the book. And then Mara and I are going to talk about it and get into some of the themes a bit more in depth, depending on where Mara directs our attention. So let me just start, and we're just on the title slide here, by saying that, in the simplest sense, this book is about what happened when a cheap, popular consumer market in generic medicines took off with enormous vigor in Mexico in the early 2000s. Now, by generic medicines, I mean what you probably think I mean, which is medicines that are no longer under exclusive patent protection, medicines that are sold by their chemical or generic name rather than a brand name or the original brand name. So we're talking about citalopram versus Lexapro or ibuprofen instead of Advil, right? These are medicines that are same but cheaper, right? This is the promise of generic substitution. Now, the questions I started asking at the very beginning of this project, a long time ago now, early 2000s, were, the kinds of big questions you might expect, possibly. My questions were, for example, would a brand new market in generics radically change the calculus of health access in Mexico? Would generic substitution be the key to a 21st century politics of the copy in which Mexico might once again try to get out from under the thumb of US and European and multinational drug companies, as they had tried to do in a complicated way under Luis Echeverria in the 1970s. Now, I came by those questions honestly, which is to say non-arbitrarily. This is around the same time, certainly, that HIV and AIDS treatment activism internationally was shining a very bright spotlight on the dangerous effects that new intellectual property regimes were having on matters of life and death, magnified by the radical changes anticipated when pharmaceutical producers, say in Brazil or India, Argentina, even South Africa, would suddenly be under the restrictions of these new patent laws, constraining what Argentine trade negotiator Carlos Correa called the fundamental right to copy. So ensuring that medicines could continue to circulate untethered from the monopoly control of big pharma had at the time become key to fights for health justice on a global scale. So that's how I started. I'm asking big questions. I'm hoping to be taken seriously after all this work on these big, important questions. And Janet, if I could have the next slide, please. This is where it went. These are the kinds of things I'm getting press requests about right now. This is Dr. Simi, if you can see these images from now the Dr. Simi official TikTok account. This is Dr. Simi. This is a copy of Dr. Simi. These are 3 or 4 of the many thousands of versions of the mascot of, next slide, please, the Mexican generics pharmacy chain, Farmacias Similares, or similar pharmacies. Now, Dr. Simi, as you can see in this photo here with a human or a couple humans, he's the alter ego of Similares founder, Victor Gonzalez Torres, who together as man and mascot, next slide, please, have done many things. This is a little nice image of a feel-good message of self-transformation. But the self-transformation has gone in some interesting directions. Next slide, please. Now, together, man and mascot, Dr. Simi Composite, have mobilized against corruption and for assistance or social support for those who have the least. Next slide, please. They have convened thousands of people in marches against that same corruption in Mexico City. They have together run for president of Mexico. This was in 2005 in the lead up to Dr. Simi's run for president in 2006. Now, as you might have surmised, Victor Gonzalez Torres and Dr. Simi traveled a very wide arc very quickly, traveling from or moving from a kind of quasi-populist nationalism. So in the early 2000s, when Simi emerged on the scene, he did so under this rallying cry of defend your domestic economy, right? From that kind of callback to the era of import substitution, industrialization, the politics of pharmaceutical sovereignty, Dr. Simi, landed very quickly in a wholesale war on the state and its healthcare institutions. Next slide, please. Now, over the last 20 years, so from in the first 2 decades of the 21st century, Dr. Simi and his pharmacies have made spectacularly visible how a cheap popular market and generic drugs can configure not just pharmaceutical access, but the composition of the healthcare state in a larger sense. They might even, these generics, give us a language for politics itself in pharmaceutical form. Now, it's that move that I gesture to when I invoke the notion of Simi politics, and I hope through the course of the next 45 minutes, we will together, Mara and I will figure out what that means. Now, Farmacias Similares definitely started off with a bang. the generative potency of their name certainly seemed to be mirrored in their, what I like to call their vociferous rate of proliferation through a very aggressive franchise model. So Simi started with 8 storefronts in 1999, and that number quickly ballooned to around 3,500 in Mexico, and there are even more today. Now, the Simi prefix quickly became attached to just about anything: the Simi condom, the Simi Chicas, so his spokesmodels, the Simi Seguro, which was Dr. Simi's short-lived version of a health insurance scheme. At the same time, their slogan, lo mismo pero más barato, right? The same but cheaper, registered trademark, brilliantly laid claim to the very principle of generic substitution itself. Now, Simi also quite quickly tried to develop a presence across Latin America. And those who've seen him in Chile, or his pharmacies anyway, or maybe in El Salvador, in Argentina, the subject of chapter 3, will have noted that he's established himself quite widely. But of course, he's not alone in this lively commercial sphere in any context. Now, in Argentina, for example, which is actually the subject of chapter 3 of the book, Dr. Simi is joined there in lively competition with big chains like Pharmacity, but also with the pharmacy, next slide please, run by Dr. Simi's own brother, Dr. Discount, Dr. Ahorro, who, as you can see in that slide, has cheekily copied his brother's slogan. Instead of it's the same but cheaper, it's equal but more economic. Next slide, please. Now, in Mexico, similarly, Dr. Simi is not alone either. There he is joined by thousands of other generics pharmacy entrepreneurs who sprouted up alongside and in competition with him. So you get, thousands and thousands of shiny chains and shabby franchises and little mom and pop sort of kioscos. Crucially, many of these do not just sell generic medicines. Following a model pioneered by Similares, many of these pharmacies, no matter how large or small, offer low-cost primary consultations with physicians as part of their business. And you can see in that one image the last part of the word consultorio there. This is a small outlet that has sort of copied Similares' own language and discount slogan, etc. Right? Okay, so this new popular, and I would say a popular private sphere, founded on the very simple premise of generic substitution, has utterly changed the pharmaceutical and healthcare itineraries of millions of people in Mexico in the last 20 years. Now, this is, next slide, please, especially important because 50% of people in Mexico do not have formal employment, and thus do not or did not, when this market was created in the early 2000s, have access to the public health system at all. But there's much more to this transformation still. Now, generic substitution has become, we might say, much more than a matter of simply replacing one drug with another. As Marx or Diane Nelson, my dear colleague, have taught us so well, the substitution of equivalence can't do anything except generate a whole mess of excess. Now, some of that excess is categorical. Next slide, please. Generics, interchangeables, similars, you can see those terms, if I'm on the right slide still, all on these marquees here in front of you. The GI, the GI in this slide on the left is referring to an official insignia of the Mexican state that indicates a drug that has been registered as an interchangeable generic as opposed to a regular generic. The idea of the similares sort of circulates alongside regular generics and interchangeable generics. These kinds of drugs all tumbled into pharmacies at once, and they compete, therefore, not just with originals, but with each other. So generic medicines in themselves have become different kinds, almost proper nouns. Generics in the Mexican market, and certainly helped along by Dr. Simi, have become sites and sources of distinction. But that's not the only thing at stake. I'm going to just read, if you'll indulge me, from just a little bit of the introduction, just a couple sentences here. So in Dr. Simi's hands, the generic formula, actually, let me just start here. Pharmaceuticals or drugs themselves were only one locus of substitution and its excesses. In Dr. Simi's hands, the generic formula, the same but, provided a syntax for some uncanny simulations of deeply familiar, even cartoonishly recognizable populist politics and tactics. Next slide, please. From the attempted run for president to the mural adorning a central stairway in Similares' corporate headquarters. So a terrible Simi version of Diego Rivera's famous nationalist mural in Mexico's Palacio Nacional, and much, much more. Corporate sash, corporate hymn, corporate flag. Now, Dr. Simi's explicitly political imitations and interventions gave tangible shape in turn to a much larger pharma political transformation in Mexico and beyond. Well past Dr. Simi, the rise of los genéricos has created an almost infrastructural market force in which generics and their similars do not solely compete with drugs made by the transnationals. Instead, the commerce in generics has come to copy and compete with the Mexican state in delivering primary care and medications to millions of people. Now, the title of the book points to these two ways, these two sites of excess, we might say, in which generic medicines have become spectacular. And the first, is this sort of way that they have become hyper-visible objects of mass consumption. And the second is the ways that the commerce in generics has become the centerpiece of a certain kind of political pageantry in which generic drugs, and Dr. Simi's machinations in particular, have become the site or the centerpiece again for the performance of the promises of a populist state in the form of a consumer market. And it's that move in part that the term Simi politics refers to. Now, I'll just say, wrapping up my initial comments here, that the challenge of this book, writing it, but I'm guessing reading it also, is the challenge of trying to hold these two threads together simultaneously to get a feel for the way that the one redounds in the other. And so with that, I'm gonna stop with my sort of formal comments and hope that Mara can help us get into the thick of it here. Janet, were we last on same and not the same? Okay. That skipped ahead a little bit. Sorry, we miscued a little. All right.
Thank you so much, Corey. So first of all, I just want to thank you for the invitation to comment on the book and to engage in conversation with you about it, but mostly just to thank you for writing this brilliant book. I'm sure I'm not the first and probably won't be the last to tell you that this is nothing short than a spectacular contribution. Sorry about that. So it's a bit challenging. It was a bit challenging. It still is a bit challenging to decide among many possible starting points for a generative conversation, where to anchor and where to begin. And I think that difficulty is because this is a book that contains multiples. There are multiple brilliant theoretical engagements and analytic insights in this book. These engagements and insights resonate and will be generative for STS scholars focused on the politics of commensurability, for example, for social theorists who think hard about the perplexities and the enchantments and also the potential disenchantment of the commodity form, for anthropologists of medicine and the state and its undoing, for public health scholars working on global health disparities and the politics of access, for scholars of comparative politics and political development, for scholars of intellectual property regimes, law, and ethics, for students of the political economy of pharmaceuticals, and for scholars and non-scholars alike who care a lot about the fate of struggling national healthcare systems and the intersections of these struggles with rightist and leftist and somewhere in betweenist, we can maybe discuss, populist politics around the globe. So this book is also important for Latin Americanists, for Mexicanists, and also Mexicans who want to better understand some of the dramatic transformations of state market society relationships in Mexico over the last couple decades. And even that, I think, doesn't cover the full potential audience for this remarkable book. There are also multiple stakes at play in this book, for multiple actors and for multiple possible worlds in the making. These worlds range from an unlikely, but perhaps still possible, we hope still possible, more just world in terms of all human beings' ability to live healthy lives. But then they also range to an even more severely unjust world that continues to structurally and brutally deprive opportunities for good health to the majority of this world's human beings. So as you all in the web space, webinar space, Zoom spaces, you all got a taste from Corey's brief presentation of the book. There are multiple threads in the book, multiple arguments, and especially two core threads that are expertly brought together into a unified narrative and argument. Each of the threads has its own properties and its constitutive features and its relations to the other threads, and also its constituting effects. I deeply appreciate in this book how each of the threads is treated with care and nuance and an incisive analytic eye in and of themselves. And simultaneously, the threads are expertly woven together. It's just a remarkably, brilliantly well-crafted book. And it's remarkable to me how a book that is so theoretically sophisticated and nuanced and rich and multiple and analytically complex and covering empirically such a messy and difficult terrain from multiple perspectives can at the same time be such an easy, entertaining, and even fun book to read. So yes, fun. So one other thing, as an aside that I really appreciate about this book is how the analysis and the narrative throughout is punctuated by these moments of illuminating humor. It's the kind of humor, yes, that's sort of superficially funny, but also hits a deeply serious nerve because it's all connected ultimately to life or death consequences that are at stake for those in the so-called bottom of the pyramid in development speak. So I'm just going to start and try to select out and speak to a few of the multiple insights and contributions of the book today. And as a broad frame for my initial line of questions to you, I want to ask about, for you to talk a little bit more about the different others against which generics gain their existence as such. The others that make generics generics. So the others that help constitute their meaning, their import, their potency, their place, and their politics. So to start, I'd like to hear you say a little bit more about a question at the core of your book that seems like a very simple book, but that we learn in your book is anything but. And that's the question of what is a generic? That is, what makes a generic a generic? And in answering this, I'd like you to say a little bit more about the book's title, which you did say a little bit about in your initial comments. But to confess, when I first heard the title of your book, I was kind of like, huh, like that emoji that looks puzzled, that one. So the word, and that, I was like that because the word spectacular and the word generic just do not seem to go together. They seem, if not opposites, at least adversarial. they push against each other as if they do not want to be placed side by side. And so this tension, of course, is precisely to the point of your argument in the book. And indeed, the title contains your argument in those two words. And so I'd like you to just unpack a little bit more for us what is a generic and what it is that defines the spectacular. What do you mean by this term in the book? What is it that makes something spectacular? And maybe in answering this, to keep it, I know this is the whole book in a sense, but to keep your answer pinned to something concrete, maybe I was thinking you could share that poster of the lime popsicles that's in the book, which I also found especially enjoyable because I live in a household of lime popsicle fanatics. So
okay. Thanks, Mara. I mean, while I call that image up, I just want to say, whoops, that's not working out. Hold on, let me stop that. Defeated by Zoom. It's as if I've never used this before. Hold on. Mara, I just want to say thank you for that really kind opening. And if I didn't say it before, I did mean to say you are the most incisive, generous reader I've ever. So I really appreciate those comments. So you've just asked me a question that is the heart of the book, and let me see if it's possible for me to address it in any way that is remotely adequate to the question. And can I make this smaller? Come on. Hold on. I'm having technical issues. Hold on. I'm going to talk. And
I don't have it
in front of you. So while I figure this out, I am going to say that the very question of what a generic is something that I actually was an incredible writing challenge, because I don't think I ever defined it on purpose. Because one of the things that you learn getting into this material very, very quickly is that there is no generic definition of a generic. And that in itself, that's a regulatory question, that's a pharmacological and pharmacochemical question, that is a question of history, a question of marketing vernaculars, and it's a theoretical question about what constitutes equivalence in this world of pharmaceuticals and in the world of commodity exchange. So I've just done what you asked me not to do, which is like stay big in general. So to get specific about it, and the lime popsicle poster is eluding me, but I'm gonna corral it. I'm gonna corral it any second now.
You could also just describe it if you can't.
Yeah.
It. I think
so,
there you go. Yeah.
Oh, I really hate this. I'm stopping. The lime popsicle poster and there's an elaborate kind of visual culture around generics and generic equivalents in Mexico. And let me just say, first of all, that when generics entered the private market in Mexico in the late 1990s, early 2000s, there was no kind of public category of generic medicine the way that there is here, because there was no regulatory category of generics in the private sphere of the market. So at the time, if you went to the public health sector, to IMSS or ISSSTE, you would likely be provided access to a medicine that we would call generic, that is a copy of a no longer patented medicine. But those medicines were basically the drugs that IMSS gives you. And the only drugs you could buy in private pharmacies in the early 2000s were leading brand expensive drugs, for no good reason except the sheer economic and political power that the US and multinational pharmaceutical companies held over and in relation to the Mexican state at that time. So in the first instance, to create a market for generic drugs, you had to kind of create a category of the generic that would be something different from what was already available. So the things that were already available were the drugs that IMSS gives you, or multiple illicit forms of medicines you could get a hold of on the black market, or the private expensive drugs that multinationals sort of sold to you in private pharmacies. And so what happened was the opening of a category of copied drug that didn't have content yet. It had a couple points of contrast, but it did not have an obvious meaning at that point. And so part of what happens is that you see the emergence of the generic kind of taking shape as a category that is produced by intellectual property. So in our lexicon here in the States, we talk about a generic as being the drug that is not the patented drug, right? It's the other one. It's the non-name brand drug. And in Mexico, that emerged as a kind of point of contrast for sure. But you also had the emergence of all these different kinds of generics that speak into being and that spoke into being in the public sphere of commerce, a range of different ways for medicines to be equivalent to each other. Because one of the defining features of a generic drug, as Dr. Simi captures in his slogan, lo mismo pero más barato, is that they are the same as the original, the same as the reference drug. And it turns out that in regulation and in pharmaceutical chemistry and in pharmacology, there are many ways for drugs to be the same as other drugs. And this speaks then to different regulatory thresholds. And so when I pointed out in that earlier slide that there are many kinds of generics in the market in Mexico, it is because in part there were multiple thresholds of equivalence that were recognized by the state early on that were sort of tolerated, that could coexist for a moment anyway, side by side. And those refer to different static, chemical equivalence versus bioequivalence, two different thresholds that tell us different ways of understanding how drugs are same or not the same. Now, the reason that matters in part, it's a science study story, it's an anthropology of science story where you kind of get into these things that I didn't know how to think about, that it's not just that Advil and ibuprofen both are based on 200 milligrams of ibuprofen, certainly that's the case, but they are also the products of different manufacturing processes. They might have different inactive ingredients. All of those things can affect how a drug is absorbed in your bloodstream. They can affect then how well it works. And those differences then become the basis of different regulatory thresholds. Now, the fact that in Mexico, you could have drugs in the market that were simultaneously corresponding to two different thresholds of equivalence was written into the kind of commercial vernaculars. This is how generics in part became spectacular, because a lot of the different categories that you see on pharmacy, awnings and in pharmacy names, etc., are pointing to precisely to these different thresholds of equivalence. So you have some generics that are regular generics that are the chemically equivalent ones. You have others that are intercambiables, interchangeables, and those are the bioequivalent ones. And so you have, on the one instance, the commercial sphere speaking the language of regulation and of regulatory proliferation. At the same time, you have commercial actors like Dr. Simi, who are, by virtue of their own commercial aura, producing kinds that quote unquote don't exist. So for example, in Mexico, similares are not a regulatory kind of medicine. They're not a regulatory category. As such, they quote unquote do not exist. But Dr. Simi has made such an imprint on the market, and his drugs have made such an imprint on people's sense of loyalty or distrust, frankly, that similares has this extraordinary status as a kind that people are attached to, even though they do not exist. And so you have generics in here as the product of multiple regulatory regimes, but also it's a product of the power of commercial actors and of consumer attachments to those products or to those drugs as a very powerful site of kind making in itself. There's a lot more to say about that, but that is part of what it gets to some of what you're talking about. But that proliferative excess is partly how generics become spectacular in a commercial sense, in this sense of hypervisibility. There's an argument about the commodity too. Should I go there, or do you want to go somewhere else at this point?
I do want to go there, but I think we should move on too, because I want to move us into CME politics. And I want to make sure we have time for that. So if we have time, let's circle back more to the commodity.
Yeah.
So so in your answer, you were focusing especially on the part of the book where you do a lot of work around generics as a kind of drug or kinds of drugs that are defined in relation to an other that is other kinds of drugs, which themselves it's a regulatory kind making to some extent or to large extent, against which generics as kinds of drugs are defined. But then, and there is an additional constitutive other through which the spectacular generic becomes so in your story. And one of them, or the main one, is the IMSS, the Mexican National Health System. And I just loved how you bridge the pharmaceutical, intellectual property, economics of health and medicine part of the story of generics with the political economy, state capacity, public health as access, but also as incorporation of this so-called popular sector as patient / consumer / citizens part of the story of generics.
Yeah.
And in part, if I understood this right, but so in part you build this bridge by observing and analyzing generics in Mexico, not only as objects or as drugs, but as places. And I just thought that was a brilliant move. And as places, generics have a different other that gives them their meaning and their potency in the drug sense, but in this more political sense.
Yeah.
And this other, the national health system, such as it is. So it was, for me, it was here in the argument, which is somewhere in chapter 2, where the CME political comes into clear view. This chapter on the state and not the state. And when you explain, especially how Dr. CME's pharmacy start to have these primary care clinics physically attached to them. I don't know if we have time, but I wanted to read this one paragraph. Do you think we have time? I don't know. From that chapter, page 73, where you say, Mexico's commerce in generic medicines has taken up residence at the very center of these familiar and important tensions between state and market, public and private sectors, and the broader imaginations of consumers and citizens. But I'll argue that far from delivering us to a generic critique of neoliberalism and its effects, these developments bring us to an analytic opening, a semi-political opening, I'll call it. For while the processes I am tracking are diffuse and have unfolded on a broader scale, Dr. CME, the composite actor, person, mascot, corporate entity, pharmapolitical juggernaut, looms peculiarly large. Dr. CME / Victor Gonzalez Torres has vividly theatricalized, thematized a broader dynamic in which the low-cost consumer market for pharmaceuticals and medical attention has come to both double and trouble the state, to compete with it by copying and even becoming something like it. This dynamic does not belong to him alone. Gonzalez Torres has made it spectacular, visible, vexing, and oddly his. He made his mark by selling copied drugs while simultaneously copying a version of the Mexican state, the classically clientelist Free State, precisely at a moment when the Pre's hold on power first seemed to be coming to an end. This pharma-political dynamic is what I propose to think through the idiom of CME politics. And then you say, like Dr. CME himself, the term feels perilously cartoonish, but also like Dr. CME, it's no joke. Which, yes, I appreciate it on several levels. So, question. So I'd like you to say more about CME politics as such, but in doing so, I wonder if you could address one question in particular that still puzzles me after reading the book.
Okay.
And especially given what I learned about CME politics from your book, why did this guy run for president? So I suspect that for many observers, Dr. CME's run for presidency actually did seem like somewhat of a joke. And in some ways, there's even like a faint resemblance to the story of Trump's presidential run, or even Bolsonaro in Brazil, which initially, at least in both places, folks in the media on different sides of the political spectrum kind of treated it as if they could not be serious, right? And of course, in both those places, that turned out to be gravely mistaken. Now, in the case of Dr. CME, if it's not a joke, then the run seems at first like it could at least pretty easily be explained either as a marketing ploy or maybe through a more traditional Marxist lens as, this is a guy from an oligarchic family or a particular fraction of the domestic capital who's doing politics in an attempt to, capture the state to advance his class or his familial or both economic interests, to make the regulatory environment more auspicious for the continuation and expansion of those interests, et cetera. So, but you don't read his presidential run this way in the book at all. So I'm just wondering if you can tell us, in your view, why this guy ran for president and what's the difference between seamy politics and just old-fashioned politics?
Got it. No, thank you. This is all incredibly brilliant. I'm gonna actually venture towards a screen share again because I think it's gonna help answer some of these questions. One of the things, so the puzzle here is, yes, why did he run for president? But also, what is the relation between state and market that is on view here? And one of the things that fascinates me about what happened with Dr. Simi and in relation to the healthcare state in Mexico is that the emergence of a generics market happened in the early 2000s in response to like major breakdowns in how healthcare and medicines are being provisioned, precisely given that the public health sector only covers people with formal employment. And like a guild-based, formal employment-based health care system has serious shortcomings, as we know from here as well. And so what happens is this generics market emerges at the same time that the state is also undergoing a massive expansion in the form of a program designed precisely to cover those 55 million people. This effort to kind of enroll the popular sectors, the informally employed, in the embrace of the state, if not in new idioms. And so you have this simultaneous expansion of a state, of the healthcare state, in a particular provisional and oft-criticized way, and the expansion of a private market. And they are both competing with each other for the same people, certainly. They are also weirdly entangled. And this is one dimension of the Simi politics, is the intense dependence of the one on the other. And so I will just say, as one example, the Seguro Popular was a state project to cover these 55 million people. That's a lot of people. It claimed total success by 2012. In other words, program administrator says, we have enrolled 53 million people in 9 short years or whatever. They did not expand infrastructure. They did not hire millions more doctors. They did not set up clinics. They gave people access to the state that was already under a lot of pressure, right? To state healthcare facilities. And so what happens with these cheap pharmacies, with their cheap clinics that become places, is that people see them as destinations for primary care, for attention, for care in all of the senses of the word. And they see them as both in competition and as kind of working together. And so at the infrastructural level, we can say that there's no way that the Seguro Popular could have declared victory and could have functioned to the degree that it did, covering 55 million people or 50 million people without expanding infrastructure, without having these cheap generics pharmacies with their cheap clinics around to absorb all of the excess, to absorb the people who couldn't get into the clinics, to absorb people who could not get their medicines because there are medication shortages in the public sector. This is one dimension of what's happening. At the same time, there was a lot of criticism, certainly from the left, that the Seguro Popular was sort of mobilizing as if it were a market. It was actually demand, it required premiums. It worked in this idiom of decentralization, which is very much a kind of trigger word in Mexico, certainly for neoliberalism. You know, there's a lot of critique that it was not caring for people in the way that a state properly should. At the same time that Dr. Simi is theatricalizing his promise, right, to care for the people as a market actor in the guise of a state, right? And I haven't even talked about all of the different machinations of the ways in which he inhabited that space. He, you know, would throw fiestas populares in central squares across Mexico, give out rice and beans, sell tortillas for cheap when the price of corn spiked because of NAFTA, you know, taking up all of this space in multiple registers that the PRI had kind of left open when it was finally kicked out of office in 2000 for the first time in 71 years. So there's a space to be claimed here. And Dr. Simi is claiming it, you know, as a political actor and as a provider of health and healthcare. Now, there are two different dimensions to your question here. I mean, actually, there are many, but one is, you know, I find fascinating what he's doing in this, precisely in this guise as a quasi-political actor, because whether it's just a marketing trope or not, one of the, maybe I'm reading him symptomatically because I can't get inside his head, right? But what is he symptomatically showing us? It's that there is a space to be claimed here around the provision of health and healthcare in precisely in the name of populism, or of a certain kind of populist pageantry and populist performance that, you know, that goes well beyond the atomizing idioms of the market. So he, not once did he say, the state has no place in providing healthcare. The market can do it much more efficiently, or the market can do it better. He said the state has an absolute duty to provide, and it is failing, and I am here to provide as if I were the state. Right, and it's that as if populism that fascinates me. So that's one part of it. This, yeah, there's more to say, but there's something about the way that it's hard to tell sometimes which is state and which is market that that evokes the semi-political for me, or that is the reason for evoking the semi-political for me. I would say one last thing too about that, which is that, as you see in this picture, like one of the things that González Torres is doing is hailing his constituency as if they were a citizenry, hailing clients, hailing customers as if they were citizens, right? And that to me is it's certainly a cynical move, but it's also to me that's semi-politics in action as well. If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that's great. It reminds me, I mean, what you just said about how he's, you know, his persona is this guy who cares for the people, but as a market actor and as someone who's at the top of the market, right? He's like one of the richest men in Mexico or something. And so, and then there's this idea also of reading him symptomatically, which I also really like. And it reminded me of the line in your book where you quote him as calling himself Che Guevara in a Mercedes.
Che Guevara and a Mercedes, like, yes. He said, I am
this is
Che
kind of
Guevara
like,
and a Mercedes, yeah.
Right, and he embraces that whole identity, that's his identity. I think that also kind of captures some of the tensions you're talking about and the space he's occupying and its ambivalences and contradictions, but also its success in this moment and the opening for it. Right. On that, I'm wondering if you could say a little bit, if we have time here, about, okay, so what happens when he drives his Mercedes over to Argentina? And which is actually a really nice image of, yeah. So, you know, is this semi-politics, this particular form and mode of pharma politics, a mode, a form of politics that can travel? The whole question of translation, translocation and translation of this political form, if we think of it as you know, and I really also appreciated in the book this discussion of populism as a form, not necessarily a thing with substance, with you have, you know, a checklist of attributes, but rather it's partly about the form of doing politics that is what you're seeing there. Does this form travel? What happens when he goes to Argentina? Why? I mean, I know because if you've read the book, he meets a fracaso. It totally fails. But why? Like, what's that story about?
Yeah, thank you. So the reason I went back to this slide is because those of you who might have noticed blue and white balloons in the back, this is actually at a Similares opening in Buenos Aires, where he tried to domesticate his Mexican enterprise by pulling on the trappings of Argentine nationalism. Yeah, what happens when Dr. Simi drives his Mercedes to Argentina? It doesn't go that well. It is a long story, but let's start by just saying he and his brother, in fact, Jorge, who runs Farmacias del Ahorro, land in Argentina in the early 2000s, right after the massive economic crisis, 2001, 2002, in which medicines and access to insulin and other drugs was very much at the center of the crisis. They show up thinking there is a market here for cheap generic medicines, right? Exactly what they're thinking in Mexico. Now, the tricky part is that they land in Argentina, they set up shop there, and in Argentina at the time, there was a very strong and determined argument that said that in Argentina, no hay genéricos, no existen, right? There's no such thing as the generic in Argentina. And so how do two Mexican entrepreneurs, in fact, not just Simi, but Simi and his double, how do they try to make a go of it in Argentina that actually has a very strong national, domestic pharmaceutical industry in which generic medicines do not exist? And it becomes a question that made me have to reimagine a very banal sentence, which is like, or even phrase that I repeated a million times in the book, in Mexico, the market for generic medicines does X thing, right? Well, in Argentina, there was no market for generic medicines because there were no generic medicines because, back to your initial question about the others to generics, Argentina had very, very strong sort of politics or nationalist politics around refusing pharmaceutical patents, so protectionist politics that insisted that pharmaceuticals are part of the public good, should not be subject to patents, and therefore that was not amenable to recognizing transnational companies' patents. This means that Argentine companies who were copying drugs patented elsewhere were actually the leading brands. They constitute the top sector of expensive name brand drugs. And the argument in Argentina was that because there were no patents, enforced patents, there could be no generic drug, that a generic only makes sense when there is a patent regime. So that becomes a very interesting, complex argument around intellectual property and what happens, the ways that intellectual property regimes really structure our grammar. Like the very fact that I could start off saying a generic drug is that which is no longer under patent tells you how intimately linked those two things are. And Argentine pharmacoeconomists and policymakers who I talked to were saying over and over again, like the generic travels with patents. It's not set up against it, right? There's only a generic drug if you have a patent regime in force. And if you do not have a patent regime in force, you have a very different problematic. So on the one hand, that there's a scrambling of categories that you have to contend with to even answer the question, what happens when Dr. Simi goes to Argentina? Like what market is he even intervening in? The other thing that happens though, is that given the crisis, given the fact that a lot of people were under a lot of economic pressure, there was some interest in being able to buy cheaper medicines. And so it's not that there was no interest in cheaper copies. There was just a very complicated question of what you would call those copies. They were sort of cheaper copies of copies. That's another taxonomic description or taxonomic discussion. But part of what happens is that in trying to parse out what happened when Dr. Simi goes to Mexico, is that you have to kind of reconfigure every part of the question. What is a market for generics when generics don't exist? What is a Mexican entrepreneur doing in a highly protectionist context in which Argentine leading labs are very protective of their market share? What happens when those same Argentine labs, who are very adept at copying patented drugs from multinational companies, and therefore have been at loggerheads with those multinational companies for since Menem, what happens when policymakers do try to impose or create some kind of market for these cheaper generic medicines or medicines known by their generic name? Well, one of the things that happened in Argentina is that the domestic industry joined forces with the transnational labs, the ones that they had been at loggerheads with for 20 years, both of them to fight these moves to encourage generic prescription, for example. So very complicated re-articulation of interests in which none of the constituent elements kind of is recognizable from what was happening in Mexico, right? So trying to track what happens to Dr. Simi entails in part figuring out what the populist nationalist configurations of capital are that create a space for the sale of cheaper copy drugs. What do you call them? Does it matter that these guys are Mexican? Yes, in fact, it turns out it did. And the spoiler is not that there was no room for someone like Dr. Simi. The spoiler is that in Argentina, actually, what matters is not necessarily originality, but which copy gets on the market first. And Dr. Simi was slow, and he got there second. His brother beat him to the spot, and Similarities found it very, very hard to do business there in a way that was that's very interesting. So it kind of gives a different spin on all of the questions that define the terrain of the generic in Mexico. Hope that sort of got there.
Oh, that's great. He should have flown instead of driven his Mercedes.
I should have flown, I know.
So I have one more question, but for now, at the end of the book, and actually your story of Argentina is kind of foreboding for what seems to be happening now in Mexico and at the end of the book. Like at the end of the book, you arrive at this place, I think, where trust in third-party regulators of generics in Mexico seems to have almost entirely disappeared, and alongside, the more general decline in the trust of the state. And you have this fantastic discussion and analysis of the various ways that Mexicans are managing this uncertainty and trying to generate trust for themselves in the medicines that they are buying and taking through various individualized strategies of confirmation, in the absence of trust created or provided as a public good, like through a regulatory agency that people can trust. And then you quote this interviewee who says, essentially, don't worry about it, because the transnational pharmaceutical companies are coming back to Mexico and will soon sort this all out. And in part, this is a reference, I think, to the emboldened stance of pharmaceutical companies as they're developing more and more biomedicines, which they say, by definition, cannot be copied. So, this means there can be no generics for a different reason why there can be no generics in Argentina. In this case, each drug will be its own irreducible, uncopyable thing made what it is as such by the trade secreted process of its making, something like that. This means a world where those who can afford, to me, it means a world where those who can afford to purchase biomedicines can have restored trust in what they are purchasing. And it also means a world that looks like a complete dystopia for the questions of health access that originally motivated your research. So at the end of your book, you say that you are resolutely determined not to end on such a dystopic note, having come all this way. And so just picking up on that resolution, I'm wondering if you could comment on where we can look for countervailing forces to the sort of emboldened enclosures and capture and monopolization the resource and health hoarding essentially of global pharma capitalists as they extend into branded generics or into biomedicine. Where do we look? You know, if not for a utopian solution, I'm not asking for that, but at least for some like partial antidote, something to help inoculate us from what really looks to be a looming victory of the capitalist pharma politics over any form of CV politics or other mode of more equitable health access in the years ahead.
Yes. You know, let me say one answer, which is so perverse, given how I have been trained, and certainly for where any person with any Marxist bone in their body will. One answer is in the mere commodity, is in the commodity. But let me try and figure out how to get there. So one of the things that you're referring to, Mara, is at the end of the book, the last chapter is about two different ways in which transnational companies are sort of making their move back into the very markets that these generic drugs were supposed to sort of be pushing them out of, or supposed to be offering an alternative within. And there are two different ways that is happening. The biodrug version that you are referring to is just in the world of biological pharmaceuticals, which is a particular kind of drug that is more complex than one based on a single chemical compound, that involves biotech vectors and often live cells to produce the medicine. The arguments have been, and these are biotech companies making the arguments, that the drugs are so complicated to make and they're so dependent on the specific mechanisms of their manufacture that you cannot, that by definition, there can be no generic version. Because if another lab makes that drug, it's a different process, and therefore the process imprints the drug differently, and therefore it's a different drug. So they're arguing self-interestedly and creatively that it is definitionally impossible to create a same enough biological drug, or for other labs to do so, and therefore there can be no generic biological pharmaceutical, and therefore, you know, every drug is just going to kind of be, you know, its own uncopyable singular thing, right? This fantasy of the triumph of distinction over any kind of mere commodification, right? Now, the reason I say mere commodification is because in this world, and in the world of patent holding pharma companies, when your drug loses its patent protection, it becomes a mere commodity. That is it's a site of abjection. It's a fall from patented unique grace into the world of mere interchangeability. And one of the things that's happening in this fight over biopharma, and their vision that biological drugs are not copyable is not, it's not actually coming to fruition. Regulatory agencies in Europe are saying, actually, yes, we can, and here's how we're going to do it. But this is their fantasy, right? Is that there will be no mere commodity, there will be no mere copy, that there can only be distinction, even in the terrain of the generic. And this has absolute direct consequences for questions of affordability, of trust, of access, etc. It's a dystopic view that they are sort of trying to argue for in front of regulators, and they're losing that argument. But it does raise the question then of, you know, where does a solution to the quote unquote problem of access come from, right? It's probably not going to come from patent holding industry. We sort of know that. There are multiple kind of technocratic experiments going on in the world. There are folks who've been working on the idea of a patent pool, trying to re-engineer the political economy, international political economy of pharmaceutical production, so that it's not driven by the logic that that companies have to charge exorbitant prices in order to quote unquote recoup their investment, et cetera, et cetera. Like there are interventions in that logic at a technocratic level. But I think there are more interesting and more vexing and more frustrating questions around the very possibility of a kind of progressive public health driven, I don't know, I don't want to say nationalist project, because I certainly don't want to put my cards on the national, go all in on nationalism as if that's going to solve anything. There are bigger philosophical questions here too. I mean, one of the things that hovers over this entire book and the questions that I'm asking is the way that access to medicines and pharmaceuticals has become so synonymous with health and health justice in the first place. That's what João Beal and Adriana Paterno and others call the pharmaceuticalization of public health, right? Seeding that equation is a problem, and one could step back from that and take the lead of others who are trying to promote public health. I don't have a lot of faith in that in this country right now, certainly. But I said something about how, like, if you are talking about access to medicines, strictly speaking, that ensuring that there are regulatory regimes that allow for mere copies to be produced and to circulate becomes, again, a really big terrain of struggle. It wasn't just in the late 1990s with HIV/AIDS medications. Now that patent regimes are in place, now that the first wave of patents have been expired in these places that had to accede to patent laws, right? We've gone through that cycle already. We're in this post-patent world. Not that the patents are no longer important, but many drugs are off patent in legal terms in places like Mexico and Chile and Brazil, Argentina, right? Drugs are off patent, and there's a big political struggle around what happens then. It's not just that getting drugs out from under patents resolves the contradictions of access. What Dr. Simi and Market and Generics shows is that once you liberate medicines into a private market, you're creating an entire new set of tensions and contradictions, and very hard to resolve politics. Maybe I'll stop with that point. I'm looking at you over there because on my screen you're over there, but anyway. Oh, you're muted, Mara.
Oh, good. So I think I don't know if we have questions from the
yes.
from the room or
Thank you
room.
for your presentation and your wonderful questions, Mara. I was so entertained that I didn't want to interrupt, but we have some questions from the audience. I'm going to start with one question from Darius. How has this similares market been impacted by gringos like myself who frequently cross the border to take advantage of the low price drugs I can buy in Mexico? Often without expensive doctor prescription, I will be required to present in the US.
Yes, this is one of the markets for CIMI for sure. And not just CIMI. I think I would be curious, well, you don't have to tell me what pharmacies you go to, but I would be very curious. I mean, I think there are two dimensions to this. On the one hand, even before the generics market was a thing in Mexico, people from the States were going because even the high-priced name brand drugs in Mexico were cheaper than they are here. So there's a thing of how prices are tiered for different markets. Anyway. But yeah, Dr. Simi's pharmacies are a beacon for lots of people in for lots of different reasons. He also markets himself as if he's, aiming towards the popular sectors, but these pharmacies would not exist without a very robust kind of middle-class clientele as well, right? So yes, I'm sure he thanks you, Darius, for your custom. But it's very much, it's a draw for many kinds of people, and exactly for the reason you just noted. I want to know when he's going to open his first storefront in like LA. This is my big question.
Second question from Valdemar. Could you discuss the overlap between the US regulatory parameters regarding similar molecules and the Mexican parameters? Are the Mexican ones a copy paste of the US ones?
Thank you for that question. Oh, did I stop my share? Hold on.
Yes.
Let me call up a screen real
Okay.
quick. So this isn't going to answer your question, but it's a prompt for me to address a couple things from your question. Yes, so medicines had circulated in the public sector, as I mentioned, as what we might call generics, from the 1950s until 1997, actually, is when the first law of generic medicines was put in place in this new regime. And what happened in 1997 and 98 and all of the succeeding laws that were trying to put these regulations into effect was that you see the way that NAFTA, so NAFTA is entirely part of this story here, that Mexican political authorities and within the trade agreements and trade negotiations agreed that in signing on to NAFTA and in signing on to patent protections, they were also going to sign on to certain kinds of regulatory harmonizations of what would count after patents expire on drug, like what would count as an official, approvable, legitimate kind of generic equivalency. And so what NAFTA demanded was that the old regime of generic equivalence based on chemical equivalence, which is the one that had been operable within EAMS, the public sector, for 50 years, 47 years, that no longer be allowed to stand, that the requirement was that Mexico sign on to the higher threshold of bioequivalence. Higher, more expensive is another way to describe it, more expensive to test for. Bioequivalence is a regime of equivalence testing that takes you out of a chemistry lab and into a laboratory with human subjects. You're testing the rate of the absorption of two drugs. You're comparing the rate of absorption of two drugs in the bloodstreams of healthy volunteers. This regime of bioequivalence was sort of established first in the United States in around 1984. And it has become wrapped into demands for generic equivalence regulation precisely through the travel of these liberalized trade agreements and the intellectual property and regulatory harmonizations that travel with them, right? So there are some slight differences, and I don't have a slide pulled up, but one of the differences is that the Mexican regulatory regime, COFEPRIS, allows for a little more wiggle room in what drugs are required to go through bioequivalence testing, for example. And so I don't have the language in front of me, but the language is very interesting. It's like, a generic drug is one that is usually bioequivalent according to the parameters that might be necessary for this. In that case, maybe there's a lot of hedging in ways that FDA is like, a generic drug is bioequivalent with its reference drug. There is a massive geopolitics around that. Argentine labs and a lot of domestic producers in Mexico were very much resistant to the imposition of bioequivalence requirements along with patent laws and IP in the late 1990s, arguing, we've been doing this perfectly well for 50 years. Our drugs are excellent. The Argentine labs are like, we copy to the letter. So not the regulation, but the drug itself. We copy to the letter. Our drugs are very good. Why are you demanding this extra, very expensive test, like $100,000 per drug? And that is a cost that generics labs themselves have to front. So there's a lot of political maneuvering around literally the politics of bioequivalence, who's demanding it and why. the Mexican regulatory agency under pressure from NAFTA or through agreements made via NAFTA have signed on to bioequivalence as the standard that should eventually reign over this one. But when generics first arrived, these two were circulating in markets at the same time, which was slightly unusual and very interesting. I don't know if that answered your question. I hope so.
Thank you for that. Are you open for a last question?
Sure.
Great. This question is from Maria. Can you talk more about how the state and farmacias similares are competing? Could it be argued that they are complementing each other in their efforts to provide healthcare access to the people that cannot afford expensive brand meds?
Absolutely. And that is partly the point of CME politics in a way, is to not simply sign on to a story that they are in competition, but to show the degree to which they are entangled with each other. Now, the story of a happy complementarity, though, is a little complicated, right? In part because of the González Torres family's involvement, centrality in Green Party politics in Mexico. So the Partido Verde Ecológico de México, the PVEM, not very green, famously not very green, like they support the death penalty. And anyway, they're a complicated version of a Green Party, but they were founded by one of González Torres's family members. Several González Torres family members who own pharmacies are central figures in the party. That party became, they self-declared as the Party of Access to Medicines in between 2006 and 2012. They've put forth a series of measures that would channel disaffected customers. So people who had prescriptions from IMSS or ISSSTE, for example, but couldn't get those prescriptions filled. There were these measures that the Green Party was promoting that then the Peña Nieto actually signed on to in 2012 as part of his platform, to say, sure, if you cannot get your prescription filled at IMSS or ISSSTE, bring your prescription to a private pharmacy, and the private pharmacy will fill your prescription. The state will reimburse that private pharmacy for the medicine at private sector prices. Yeah. So back to your argument, Mara, your straw argument about capture, and about sort of a nationalist, protectionist capitalism kind of going all out here. It's a very complicated entanglement, I think, is what I would say to the question. But they are absolutely staking a claim to try, and they're still vying to cover, there's still a contest about who and what shall be able to provide medicines and primary care to people who are not formally employed and part of these institutes, right? So you might know, if you follow Mexican politics, shortly after López Obrador on the left was elected president in 2018, he abolished the Seguro Popular. He criticized it as being ni seguro ni popular, a critique from the left that was quite similar to what Farmacias Similares had been, or what Dr. Simi had been arguing. AMLO, this was just before COVID became a thing, so he couldn't have known, but he abolished the Seguro Popular completely in 2019 and set up his own properly national healthcare system, as he's describing it, one that would truly provide for everyone else for free. It has gotten off to a hard start precisely because of when it hit, as a, in addition to other factors. And one of the things I end the book talking about, the shaky story of these two agencies, while Farmacias Similares, doing business at a mighty fine clip, like they're not suffering. But the public agencies are in a kind of current state of churn, right? And of precarity. And I find that very interesting and a little, a little dispiriting, actually. Back to Mara's question about, what are the beacons of light? I I wish there were more. I wish I had the answers to that question. Oh, I ended on a pessimistic note again. Sorry.
Thank you. I don't know if you have any last question, Mara, for Corey. I want to be respectful of your time.
Yeah.
So
No, I think
I'm-
I just thanks again for writing such a generative book. And yeah, it was a really interesting conversation and just a pleasure to spend some days thinking with you about it.
Thank you, Mara. You are just a brilliant reader, and I've really learned a lot just thinking with your questions. Thank you. And thank you, Janet, for making this happen.
on behalf of the Center for Latin American Studies, I want to thank the two of you for accepting our invitation, for being here today. It's been such an interesting conversation. I'm sharing our sign up for newsletter link in the chat. We're going to be sharing this recording after we edit it with the slides. Thank you for attending our event, everyone. Have a good rest of your
Thanks,
afternoon.
everyone.
Thank you, Janet.
Thanks.
Thanks, Mara. Thanks, everyone.